Hello Internet. This is the last part of our how to make a food delivery app with DollarBackend and Flutter course. We were using Strapi as our ready-made backend, and in part 1 we made a menu items list. In part 2 we learned how to show menu items details. In part 3 we will be learning how to make an order page for our app. If you're new around here, we also have a written version of tutorials on dollarbackend.com/blog. And while we're here, consider checking us out on dollarbackend.com. We can host a bunch of backends for you, be it Strapi, Pocketbase, Pause. So consider checking us out on dollarbackend.com. Yeah, let's get to the video. Okay, so far we have a grid with all items and we have a particular item's details. Now what we need to do is we need to add a shopping cart. We already have order.dot where our shopping cart is going to be, but first let's talk about how we're gonna add stuff to the shopping cart. On the details page, we need to add a button to add, for example, a salad to a shopping cart. Before we add a button, we need to have a list of items that we will be keeping in our cart. We have already decided to keep a list of repositories in the repositories folder. Repositories usually keep the data by themselves, or they allow us to interact with the data somehow. For example, menu items repository can fetch a list of menu items, and it can fetch one menu item based on its ID. We're going to be keeping a list of grocery cart menu items. Menu items repository doesn't quite fit us. Let's create a new file and we will call it cart.dot. Inside of this file, we need to create a cart repository. We'll be using a singleton pattern for our cart repository. To create a singleton in Dot, first of all, we need to initialize the constructor. For those of you who don't know, a singleton is a design pattern that allows us to have one object in memory and to reference this object multiple times throughout our app. In our case, cart repository is going to be a singleton, and we will be referencing it in the details page when we will be adding an item to the cart. We'll also need to reference it in the order page in order to fetch a list of items in the cart and in order to send a list of items to the server. Let me go over how a cart repository works. First of all, we need a static final cart repository cart. We can remove this word because it just specifies the type. Cart repository will be working the same. Static means that cart object can be shared between all instances of cart repository classes. When someone creates a new cart repository, they create a new instance. Static means that cart can be shared between all of those instances. Final is kind of like const in JavaScript. It means that this item cannot be reassigned. Then we need to have a cart repository constructor. Usually we would have a constructor just like this, just cart repository, opening bracket, closing bracket, and then a semicolon. And this would be our constructor. However, we need to reuse the same instance of cart throughout all cart repository instances. And for that, we need to override our constructor. I overrode a constructor using a factory keyword in Dot, then class name cart repository, and then we will return cart repository dot cart. Because of our constructor is overwritten, we cannot create a new instance of an object. If we were to say something like cart repository in here, it would reference this constructor, which means that in order to create a cart repository, we call this constructor returns cart, which calls this constructor again, and it's just not going to work. For this, we need a new private constructor. Everything prefixed with underscore in Dot is private. This syntax is a bit similar to Python. To create one instance of cart repository that we will be using throughout our app, I can just use cart repository dot underscore create. What this will do is this will create a private constructor. Now, what happened is I call .create, which is a private constructor, and it can only be called within the cart.dot file. Using create, I have created a new cart repository cart, and then every single time someone were to construct a cart repository, we will just give them the cart that we already have. This way, we can have a final list of menu item data items initialized to an empty list. Notice that items is not static. If we were to create two different code repositories, they would have two separate lists. If we were to add a salad to the left repository, the right repository would have no idea what am I talking about. But since we have overwritten our constructor, now both repositories are referencing one shared repository. This way, if we were to add, say, a salad to the left one, the right one would know that I have added a salad. So even though items is not a static variable, it will still be shared between two code repositories because we have only one static code repository. So we have an items list. We have a getter for items, which just means that you cannot overwrite our list with something else. We have a net method, which will add a menu item data to the list, and we have a clear method, which will just clear the list. Now we need to add an add to cart button to our details page. Let me open a details page. Let's make add to cart button a floating action button. For this, I'm just going to add a floating action button with floating action button of cart repository.add. Make sure to include tooltips in your floating action buttons and in your icon buttons. They allow the users who did not quite get what you meant with this icon to read a text description of a button, as well as they are read by the screen readers. So tooltips make your app more accessible. A child is going to be an icon of add. And now we need to add a cart repository. To add a cart repository, I'm going to go all the way up and just say cart repository equals to cart repository. It looks like we're creating a new instance of cart repository, but remember, we have created a singleton and we have overwritten our constructor. This means that this cart repository is actually going to reference a global singleton cart repository that we have created in here. This means when we initialize a cart repository like this, and then when we add an item, as we are adding in here, we're adding it not to the local instance that we have in details, but we're adding it to a global instance cart. If someone else were to create another instance of cart repository, just like that, they will get the same cart that we have added our items to. And you'll see it in a little while. Let me zoom out and save everything. And now we have a plus button. If I were to click on it, nothing happens. Let's create an order page now to see what exactly I have in my cart. First, let's add a button to get to the order page from the home page. I'm going to go to home.dot and I'm going to create another floating action button, which is once again going to be a floating action button. When we have clicked on it, we will push order route onto the navigation stack. I have also provided a tooltip of order, and I have also decided to customize it a little by assigning KOrder button background color for its background color and KOrder button foreground color for its foreground color. Lastly, this floating action button is going to have an icon of cart. If I were to save everything and go back, now we have an order button. About tooltips, as I said, if the user were to tap and hold on a button, they will be able to see the tooltip. I have already added a little bit of the order page to here, so let me show you what I have added. When we click on the order page, we will see this. I have converted order page into a stateful widget, then I have created a new cart repository. Even though it looks like I'm creating a new cart repository, in reality, we're just reusing this static final cart and we're accessing the same list of items that we had on the details page. Next, I have a scaffold with an app bar, a padded list view with a padded order text. Then we have a sized box. This is actually a common pattern in Dot. If you don't want to go with list view separated because it requires an item builder function, we have a padding here and an align here. We can use a size box to create a little bit of margin between the items. Then we have a build card function which returns us a list of widgets. I'll show you that in a second. Then we have another sized box to separate it a little further. Then we have a center aligned elevated button dot icon. Center aligning it means that elevated button can keep its own size without having to occupy all the items width. When we click on that button, nothing will happen for now. So we can click as much as we want, nothing happens. Then we have another button, which is a text button in this case. It has a text of clear cart, and when we click on it, it will clear the cart, deleting all of the items from it. Finally, we have a build cart function. If I were to go to build cart, I can see that it will return us a list of widgets. We'll first check if we have any items in our cart repository. Items will just return us a list of menu item data. If we have no items, we will just return a text saying we have no items in our cart. If we have our items, we will have to create an items list, which is going to be a list of widgets that will show items that we have in our cart. In here, I'm going to return a list of list styles. List style is a built-in widget in Dot, which allows you to show list styles. And while we're iterating over an array of items, I can add i.price to my total double variable. You don't have to do this. You could iterate over all of the items first to calculate the total price of the item, and then you could iterate over all of the items in order to create a widget for each of the items. But it's a bit more efficient because we're iterating over an array only once and we're doing two things at once. And then I'm going to add one last widget to my items list, which is just going to be a padded text which will say total and whatever we have calculated in our double total. Let me show you how it works. If I were to go back and add a salad, for example, to my cart, and maybe let's add an ice cream too. If I were to go back, go to my cart, you can see that I have a salad and an ice cream. Next, we need to create a new collection type in Strapi called order. We already have a menu item collection, so we can create a new collection type order similarly. Let's call it order. Then we need a text field name, which is going to be our customer's name, and it's going to be a short text. Another short text phone, which is going to be our customer's phone number. One more field, which is going to be a JSON data. And another field, which is going to be a Boolean done. Done will indicate if the order is done or not. Let's customize our order a little. Name should be a required field. Phone should be a required field. We need to contact our customers somehow. Data is going to be a required field because we need our order data. And finally, done will be a required field with a default value of false. By default, an order is not done, but when an order was cooked and done, we will set done to true manually. Our Strapi server has restarted, and now we can take a look at our content manager. We still have all of our menu items, and we will be able to see our orders right in here.